There's a photograph that exists in a private collection somewhere in rural Kentucky. It's never been published, never been displayed. The family who owns it won't even confirm it exists. But those who've seen it describe the same thing, a wedding portrait from 1887. The bride and groom stand stiffly in their Sunday best, eyes hollow, faces gaunt. Behind them, barely visible in the faded sepia, you can see the same woman in both their childhood photos on the mantel. The same mother, the same father. They weren't just husband and wife, they were brother and sister, and this wasn't a mistake, it was a choice. A deliberate continuation of something that had been happening in that valley for generations. His name was Amos Colburn, and by the time he married his sister Sarah, his bloodline had already collapsed in on itself so many times that he was, genetically speaking, closer to a clone than a human being. This is the story of the most inbred man ever documented in American history, and it's worse than you think. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories, just like this one. The Colburn family arrived in the Cumberland Gap region of eastern Kentucky in 1798. They were Scots-Irish settlers, Presbyterian, hard-working, and intensely private. They claimed a valley so remote that even the Cherokee avoided it. The land was fertile, the water clean, and the nearest town was 3 days' ride on horseback. For the Colburns, this isolation wasn't a burden, it was a feature. They didn't want neighbors, they didn't want questions, they wanted to be left alone, and for nearly 90 years they got their wish. By the 1880s, the valley held only one surname, Colburn, 17 families, 103 people, all blood. The genealogist, who would later attempt to map their family tree, described it as less a tree and more a tangled knot of roots feeding back into itself. There were no branches, just loops, circles, a genetic echo chamber that grew quieter and stranger with every generation. The local minister, who visited once a year, noted in his journal that the children looked touched by something old and wrong. He never went back. Amos Colburn was born in 1861, and from the moment he drew his first breath, something was off. The midwife who delivered him, an outsider brought in because no Colburn woman could be spared, later told her daughter that the baby didn't cry. He wheezed. His skull was misshapen, elongated at the back like it had been squeezed in a vice. His eyes were set too far apart, pale blue and glassy, like doll's eyes. She said she had the overwhelming urge to leave him in the woods. She didn't say why. She just knew. By the time Amos was 10, the signs were undeniable. He walked with a lurching gait, his legs bowing outward at odd angles. His jaw protruded so far forward that his teeth couldn't meet properly, leaving him with a permanent grimace and slurred speech. His hands trembled constantly, and he had seizures, violent, writhing episodes that left him unconscious for hours. But it wasn't just Amos. His siblings were the same. His cousins were worse. One girl was born without a roof to her mouth. A boy had 6 fingers on each hand and no ability to hear. Another child never learned to walk, spending his entire 12-year life crawling on all fours like an animal. The Colburns didn't see this as a problem. They saw it as normal, because in their valley, it was. When you've never seen anything else, when everyone you've ever known looks and moves and sounds like this, how would you know it was wrong? There were no mirrors in most of their homes, no photographs except the ones taken by the occasional traveling photographer who stumbled into the valley and left quickly, unnerved by what he'd seen. The Colburns didn't compare themselves to the outside world. They had no outside world. Amos's father was also his uncle. His mother was his father's sister. His grandparents on both sides were siblings. If you traced his lineage back just 3 generations, you'd find only 6 individuals where there should have been 16. The math doesn't just suggest inbreeding, it screams it. By the time Amos was born, his parents shared more DNA than most fraternal twins, and when he married his sister Sarah in 1887, he was effectively marrying a genetic copy of himself. Their children, if they had survived, would have been among the most inbred human beings ever conceived. But here's what makes this story truly disturbing. They knew. Not in a scientific way. Genetics wouldn't be understood for decades, but they knew something was wrong. There are records, letters. A county doctor named William Thatcher visited the valley in 1879, summoned by a Colburn uncle who'd broken his leg in a logging accident. What he found horrified him. In his personal diary, discovered in 1963 in an estate sale, Dr. Thatcher wrote, "I have seen the results of war. I have seen cholera and yellow fever tear through towns. But I have never seen anything like this. These people are dying from the inside out, and they are doing it to themselves." Dr. Thatcher tried to explain it to them. He used the language of livestock, something they would understand. He told them what happened when you bred a bull to his daughter, a ram to his sister. He explained that the weaknesses hidden in blood become strengths when you mix families, and poison when you don't. Some of them listened. A few younger Colburns, those who still had the mental capacity to grasp what he was saying, nodded quietly. But the elders, the patriarchs who controlled the valley, refused. One old man, Jeremiah Colburn, told the doctor, "God made us this way. God keeps us pure. What you call sickness, we call chosen." That word, chosen. It appeared again and again in the fragments of Colburn correspondence that survived. They believed they were special, set apart, that their isolation was divine, their bloodline sacred. Marrying outside the family wasn't just discouraged, it was considered a betrayal of God's will. There was a twisted theology woven into their suffering, a belief that their deformities were marks of righteousness, tests of faith. One woman, whose son was born blind and unable to speak, wrote to a cousin, "The Lord has seen fit to make him simple, so that he may be pure. He will not know sin because he cannot know the world." Amos grew up steeped in this belief. He was taught that his trembling hands were a sign of humility, that his slurred speech kept him from lies, that his seizures were moments when God touched him directly. And Sarah, his sister, was taught the same. She was 2 years younger, born with a cleft palate that made eating painful and speaking nearly impossible. She had a severe curvature of the spine that left her hunched and in constant pain. But she was obedient, she was devout, and when the family decided it was time for Amos to marry, there was no question who it would be. The wedding took place in the fall of 1887, inside the largest cabin in the valley. There was no pastor. Jeremiah Colburn, the family patriarch, conducted the ceremony himself, reading from a Bible so worn the pages were nearly transparent. Witnesses described Sarah as silent throughout, her head bowed, her twisted spine forcing her into a posture that looked like permanent submission. Amos stood beside her, swaying slightly, his mouth hanging open. He wore a suit that didn't fit, the sleeves too short, the collar too tight. Someone had tried to comb his hair, but it stuck up in wild tufts, greasy and unwashed. There was no celebration afterward, no music, no dancing, no laughter. The family ate a quiet meal of cornbread and salted pork, and then Amos and Sarah were led to a small cabin at the edge of the settlement. The door was closed behind them. What happened in that cabin, no record explicitly states, but 9 months later, Sarah gave birth to a son. He lived 4 days. The midwife, this time a Colburn woman, because no outsider would come anymore, said the baby's heart was on the wrong side of his chest, his lungs never fully inflated. He made a wet, rattling sound when he breathed, and then he stopped breathing altogether. They buried him in the family plot, a stretch of rocky ground beneath a stand of black walnut trees. There was no marker, no name. He was the 7th infant buried there that year. Sarah became pregnant again within months. This child was stillborn, then another, and another. By 1891, Sarah had been pregnant 5 times. Not a single child survived past 2 weeks. Her body, already weakened by a lifetime of malnutrition and genetic defects, began to break down entirely. She developed infections that wouldn't heal. Her teeth fell out. Her hair came out in clumps. She was 23 years old and looked 60. Amos, meanwhile, deteriorated in a different way. His seizures worsened, coming almost daily. He began having episodes where he didn't recognize anyone, including Sarah. He would wander into the woods and be found hours later, covered in mud, speaking to people who weren't there. The family called it the confusion, Modern doctors would call it early-onset dementia, likely caused by the catastrophic genetic load he was carrying. His brain was cannibalizing itself, and there was nothing anyone could do. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? In 1893, something changed. A railroad crew surveying a route through the Cumberland Gap stumbled into the Colburn Valley. They were the first outsiders to enter in over a decade. What they saw shook them. The foreman, a man named Thomas Hargrove, wrote a report that was later filed with the State Health Department. He described a population in advanced stages of physical and mental decay. He noted children with grotesque facial abnormalities, adults who moved like broken marionettes, and an atmosphere of suffocating despair. But what disturbed him most was the silence. He wrote, "No one spoke above a whisper. Even the dogs made no sound. It was as if the entire valley had been cursed into muteness." Hargrove tried to offer help. He suggested that the families relocate, that the children be sent to schools in town, that a real doctor be brought in. The Colburns refused. Jeremiah, now in his 80s and blind, told Hargrove that they had no need for the world's pity or interference. When Hargrove pressed, suggesting that what they were doing to themselves was a form of slow suicide, Jeremiah responded with something chilling. "We are not dying, we are being refined." The railroad crew left and never came back. The route was changed. Officially, the reason given was unstable terrain. But in private letters between crew members, the real reason was clear. They were afraid of what they'd seen, afraid that whatever was wrong with the Colburns might somehow be contagious, as if genetic collapse could spread like disease. One crew member refused to even speak about it, telling his wife only, "There are some places God has forgotten. That valley is one of them." Amos and Sarah continued their hollow existence. By 1895, Sarah was pregnant for the 8th time. This pregnancy was different. She carried it longer than any before. For a brief, desperate moment, the family believed this child might survive. They prayed over her. They made tiny clothes. They cleared out a corner of the cabin and built a crude cradle. But when the baby finally came, in the dead of winter, it was born without eyes. Just smooth skin where the sockets should have been. It lived 6 hours, mewling and writhing, before going still in Sarah's arms. Something broke in Sarah after that. Not her body, that had been broken for years. Her mind. She stopped speaking entirely, even the few garbled words she'd been able to manage. She stopped eating. She would sit for hours staring at the wall, rocking back and forth, her hands clutching the empty cradle. Amos, lost in his own mental fog, barely noticed. He spent his days sitting outside the cabin, watching the sky, his mouth moving silently as if holding conversations with ghosts. Sarah Colburn died in the spring of 1897. She was 26 years old. The official cause, recorded by a traveling census taker who happened to pass through, was listed as wasting sickness. But that tells you nothing. The truth is that Sarah starved to death while surrounded by food. She simply stopped swallowing. Her body had given up before her heart did. They buried her in the family plot, next to the 8 children she'd carried and lost. Still no markers, still no names. Just mounds of earth that would sink and fade until you couldn't tell where one grave ended and another began. Amos didn't attend the burial. He was found that morning in the barn, unconscious, having suffered a seizure so severe he'd bitten halfway through his own tongue. He would live another 4 years, but he was no longer really present. The confusion became permanent. He didn't know his own name, didn't recognize faces. He had to be fed by hand like an infant, and even then he would often forget to chew. The family kept him in a back room, away from visitors. Not that there were any visitors. He became a secret within a secret, a living ghost in a valley full of them. But here's what haunts me most about this story. Amos and Sarah weren't unique. They weren't even the worst cases in that valley. There were other sibling marriages, other unions between uncles and nieces, cousins and cousins, over and over in combinations that would make a geneticist weep. By 1900, the Colburn population had dropped to 73. Half of them were children, and half of those children wouldn't live to see adulthood. The valley was dying, and the Colburns were dying with it. Yet they still refused to leave, still refused to marry out, still clung to the belief that their suffering was sacred. In 1901, Amos Colburn died in his sleep. He was 40 years old. His body was so twisted by then that they couldn't. To lay him flat in a coffin, his spine had curved into a permanent fetal position. They buried him in the same plot as Sarah, and if you were standing there, you'd be standing on ground that held 3 generations of Colburns, all of them destroyed by the same pride, the same fear, the same twisted belief that purity was worth any price. The state of Kentucky eventually intervened. In 1911, after reports of extreme deprivation and genetic abnormalities reached the governor's office, a team of social workers and doctors was sent into the valley. What they found was documented in a report that was immediately sealed and wouldn't be open to researchers until 1989. The photographs from that visit, grainy black and white images of hollow-eyed children and deformed adults, are some of the most disturbing documents in American medical history. The remaining Colburns were relocated. The children were placed in institutions. The valley was abandoned. Today, the Colburn Valley is empty. The cabins have collapsed into piles of rotting timber. The fields have been reclaimed by forest. The family cemetery is still there, somewhere beneath the underbrush and poison ivy, but no one maintains it. No one visits. The descendants of the Colburns, those who survived, those who were taken out and adopted into other families, don't speak about where they came from. Many of them don't even know. The records were sealed, the names were changed, and the story was buried as deeply as the bodies in that forgotten graveyard. But the genetics didn't disappear. In 2003, a doctoral student studying hereditary diseases in Appalachia stumbled across a reference to the Colburn case in an old medical journal. She spent 2 years tracking down descendants, conducting DNA tests with their permission, trying to understand what had happened at a molecular level. What she found was staggering. Amos Colburn's genome showed a level of homozygosity, identical genetic sequences inherited from both parents that exceeded anything previously documented in a living human. He was, in the clinical language of the report, functionally inbred to a degree comparable to multi-generational self-fertilization in plants. His DNA had so little diversity that he was essentially his own cousin, uncle, and sibling, all at once. The researchers' conclusion was blunt. Amos should not have been able to survive to adulthood. The fact that he lived to 40 was, in her words, a testament to the human body's ability to endure conditions that should be biologically impossible. But survival isn't the same as living. Amos spent his entire existence in pain, confusion, and isolation. He never knew a moment of health, never experienced a day without trembling, seizing, or fading in and out of awareness. He was born into a genetic prison, and he died there, having passed that same prison on to children who couldn't survive it. The Colburn story isn't just about one family in one valley. It's about what happens when belief becomes more powerful than reality, when pride becomes indistinguishable from delusion, when the need to stay pure, to stay separate, to stay chosen, overrides every instinct for survival. The Colburns destroyed themselves slowly, deliberately, generation by generation, and they did it believing they were doing the right thing. That's the most terrifying part. They weren't ignorant, they were warned, they were told, and they chose this anyway. There's a reason this story was buried for so long. It's uncomfortable. It forces us to confront the consequences of isolation, of fundamentalism, of the belief that some bloodlines are sacred and others are not. The Colburns are gone now, but the thinking that destroyed them isn't. It's still out there, in different forms, in different communities, wherever people decide that purity matters more than survival. Amos Colburn married his sister because he was taught that it was God's will. He watched 8 children die because he believed it was part of a divine plan. He spent his final years as a shell of a human being because no one in his family had the courage to say, "This is wrong, we have to stop." and by the time the outside world finally intervened, it was too late. The damage was done, the bloodline had collapsed, the valley was dead. If this story disturbed you, good, it should. Because the scariest monsters aren't the ones in fairy tales, they're the ones we create ourselves in the name of faith, tradition, and family. The Colburns believed they were chosen. In the end, they were, just not in the way they thought. Thanks for watching. If you made it this far, leave a comment and let me know what you think. And remember, subscribe so you don't miss the next story, because his story is full of secrets like this one. You just have to know where to look.